Thank you, David, and good evening, everyone, wherever you are watching from across the globe tonight. I know this is always a very well-supported event by the Western Front Association, so I'm more than happy to give some time up to give you a chat tonight about Sir Douglas Haig and his role within the Royal Navy. But really, why am I giving this talk? It's a sad story, to be honest. A good friend to many of us in the Western Front Association, Robin Broadhurst, passed away rather suddenly just after Christmas, and he was planned to be the 2023 Douglas Haig Fellow. And so at very short notice, I was asked to step in and give a presentation, which of course I agreed to, before I found out what the subject was. And Robin had been working on a talk on Sir Douglas Haig and his relationship with the Royal Navy. Now, thankfully, I gave that talk a couple of weeks ago, and it was fairly well received by quite a number of Haig scholars at the annual general meeting of the Douglas Haig Fellowship. So I'm pretty pleased to be able to share some of those findings with you this evening. But the starting point with this is really there is a significant lack of resources on the relationship that Sir Douglas Haig had with the Royal Navy. It really only merits occasional footnotes in the official history, normally referring to operations on the Channel coast. The odd comment in personal papers, in fact, only just one or two references by Haig himself in his diaries. I was lucky in that Andrew Weist and Geoffrey Till both contributed papers to a 1997 book that many of you may have on your shelves called Passchendaele: A New Perspective, and that was most helpful. So together with that, some of the obvious works on Sir Douglas Haig, the official history, and quite a few naval biographies and memoirs, what I've done is I've pieced together what I hope this evening will shine a light on pretty much a forgotten aspect of Douglas Haig's career. And just to reiterate, that's his relationship and also his influence over the Royal Navy, along with his own personal interaction with a number of the personalities that commanded the senior service during the Great War. I should say as a precursor that the Royal Naval Division are not the focus of tonight's talk. My relative served in Hawk Battalion. I'm very passionate about the Royal Naval Division, and their exploits really are worthy 3 or 4 presentations on their own. And I mean this as a tribute to them. Really, it's to their credit that I would include the Royal Naval Division as an integrated part of the BEF from 1916 onwards anyway. So therefore, that's where they would sit, as opposed to an example of Army naval cooperation, which is what we're going to be looking at this evening. But let's start with the early days there, and that rather handsome chap you can see on the left of the screen is Sir Douglas Haig in the very early stage of his career. Now, it's a strange start for Haig for us to be talking about him with maritime affairs, because unlike a number of his colleagues who'd served in the Boxer Rebellion, of course, which had very much a naval maritime component to it, he didn't really have any experience of working with the Navy at all. His service had been in India, through the Sudan, South Africa, of course, and then back to India again. And aside from occasional staff posts and working at the War Office, largely these were concerned and confined to cavalry matters, about as far removed from working with the Navy as possible. The slight anomaly to this, and one I wanted to highlight, may have been perhaps when during his time in the Sudan, and certainly at the Battle of Omdurman. Now, Omdurman, Haig was actually in charge of a reserve squadron whose job it was to pursue the fleeing dervishes as they left the field of battle, but he was present and he witnessed it. And one of the things he would have seen there is the positive impact that naval gunfire support and machine gun support that was offered from a number of Royal Navy gunboats that were operating up the Nile at that time. And we do know from this moment onwards, Haig does take a close interest in the skills of naval gunfire support. He is very much a proponent of the use of the machine gun, and also he was very much impressed with naval signalling, and he makes that quite a priority as he makes his way through his career. So that might have been a place where he really gets a taste for matters. Now, where was the army and the navy as we head towards the war? And this really is a story of rearming and reorganization. And it was perhaps during Haig's time at the War Office between 1906 and 1909 that he first really comes into close contact with some of the characters in charge at the Admiralty. The Navy, of course, at this stage was going under significant reform, and that was down mainly to the chap you see there on the left, depicted on the deck of a dreadnought, which really is iconic stylistic way of suggesting that Jackie Fisher was the man who probably played the most significant role in revolutionizing the Royal Navy at a time when they went really from muzzle loading sailing ships to armed battle cruisers with submarines and aircraft carriers. So a little bit about Fisher. Well, we'll do his positives first, and certainly one of those was that he'd identified the realization that the main threat to Britain's maritime supremacy would come from the Kaiser's Germany and the way that Germany was upscaling itself. So he threw himself into a modernization plan with the Royal Navy, with the idea that they would win the next war at sea, both by domination of size and also strength and weaponry. To keep checks with this updated naval power, remember we are talking about a Royal Navy that had not fought a major sea battle since Trafalgar. I mean, there's the best part of the 19th century was colonial escapades as opposed to full-on naval battles. So it did need a real genuine overhaul and rethink, and part of that was to create a naval war college. It's fair to say Fisher perhaps wasn't the biggest supporter of this. In fact, sometimes he could be a bit of an obstacle, as we'll find out. However, under his tenure, a naval war college did begin, and alongside that there was also the opening of both gunnery and torpedo schools, so that young officers and senior NCOs could hone their talent in this new types of weaponry. Really, the biggest flaw with Fisher was his total refusal to accept the need for a naval general staff, which was something that the army had adopted several years prior to this. He felt that sailors didn't need direction and governance, that they could think for themselves, and that a sailor's role was very different to that of land forces. And of course, the downside to not having a general staff is that you really are then negating the ability to have some sort of cohesive doctrine across the whole of the Navy. It's very hard for everyone to play by the same rules because it's not coming out of some central school or central general staff as such. And as a result, your ship was really only as good as its captain. So there could be some differing standards across the Navy. Perhaps the most offensive quip that he would often use to anyone from an army background was that he genuinely felt that the British Army at this stage in history was a projectile to be fired by the Navy. And you can see that obviously doesn't go down too well in War Office circles. In fact, he's so sort of single-minded on the Navy's role in the war that Maurice Hankey comments that Fisher was hatching his naval plans in complete isolation from the General Staff of the War Office, which is not what you want as you're heading into a main European war. Now, the Navy wasn't alone in its reforms, because the chap you see on the right there is, of course, Richard Haldane, not a soldier, a politician, but someone who certainly listened, took advice, very studious man, generally seems quite popular with a lot of the men in military circles. For some of the things he does, perhaps the territorial force was a bit controversial amongst many of the regulars, but nevertheless, it was Richard Haldane that actually asked for Douglas Haig's assistance and recalls him back from India to serve at the War Office between 1906 and 1909 to assist in part with some of these reforms. Haig actually describes Richard Haldane as being a large fat man one seems to like at once, a most clear-headed and practical man, very ready to listen, and weigh carefully all that is said to him. Perhaps the thing that Haldane is most famous for is the creation of a territorial force, as we know, the 1908 territorial reforms. Perhaps less well known is actually his assistance with the creation of a specific expeditionary force that would go on to the BEF. That is an army on standby to go and to take part in a major conflict somewhere around the globe. He too realized that that main threat would be Germany. So part of this expeditionary force and its training was certainly to have a closer liaison with the French, who we felt we would be fighting alongside if things did take a turn for the worst. Winston Churchill, the chap you see in the middle, he joins the Admiralty there, and he was one of the people that really pushed for a naval general staff, much against the efforts of Fisher, who actually wanted him removed from the Admiralty as soon as he could. Get rid of Churchill, that would be a good thing for him. John Lee, very good historian, as sure many of you are aware, once wrote, or in fact advised us, that in 1911, he, that's Churchill, decided to get the rising star of the army, Sir Douglas Haig, to supply a paper on war staff organisation and begin to force the Royal Navy to accept this idea against extraordinary resistance from men who thought they knew everything there was to know about taking a fleet to war. So with that stance, and we will look at that a little bit more in a short time, we can see this may be Haig's first real influence on the Admiralty and naval affairs, is the writing of this paper at the request of Churchill. Certainly what progresses matters is the Agadir crisis. Now, a little bit of background of this for you, because we need to put it in historical context. There's a lot of tension as a lot of the Western powers are trying to expand their imperialistic or their empire across the globe. And Kaiser Wilhelm at this time certainly is accused of wanting his place in the sun, and Morocco may well have been it. At Algeciras in 1906, the Germans agreed to stay out of Morocco, and the French Foreign Legion were the Western power, or the Western Europeans that eventually went in to try and establish some control in Morocco. In 1910, the political powers within France decided to make a significant loan to Morocco, and as a result of that, part of the payback was to take control of most of the customs and the taxes that were generated from Morocco for France. And in 1910, again later that year, the French actually sent a gunboat to Agadir in southern Morocco, something that the German newspapers really did react angrily about, and a lot of people in Germany were getting most upset about what they thought was the French overstretching their responsibilities in the region. The Moroccans weren't so happy either, and in March 1911 there was a rebellion in northern Morocco, and that's when the French do send their army in to try and defend it, and this again further escalates the issues and angers the Germans, so much so that in June, and this does smack of modern problems we got around the globe now, the Germans announced that they were going into Morocco themselves to protect German citizens in southern Morocco, even though there were no German citizens in southern Morocco. And the result of that was the following month in July, Kaiser Wilhelm sent one gunship, the Panther, into Agadir, where it rescued a solitary person of German origin. Now, it was hardly World War III, but it was enough to wake up the Western powers, who now realized that Germany was a significant threat and were going to start meddling with their own empires and overseas interests. And the fallout from the Agadir crisis, as it's known, really is the reason we're talking about it tonight, is because this marks the low point between the relationship of the army and the navy, certainly when it comes to strategy. Because at a 1911 Defence Council meeting following Agadir, by which time, of course, Douglas Haig was now back in India, Chief of the General Staff, but interestingly enough, offers fortnightly letters of advice to his successor, and later his colleague Lancelot Kiggle during a meeting, one of these Haig's recommendations being read out, and Haldane reports or records what happens next. It says at a meeting of the Defence Committee, the Prime Minister was inquiring into our joint war plans. Sir Arthur Wilson, the first Sea Lord, unexpectedly said that the plan of the Admiralty for the event of war with Germany was quite different from ours. They wanted to take detachments of the expeditionary force and to land them serratim at points on the Baltic coast on the northern shores of Prussia. Now, we of the War Office at once said that such a plan was, from a military point of view, hopeless, because the railway system which the great General Staff of Germany had evolved was such that any division we landed, even if the Admiralty could have got it to a point suitable for their debarkation, would have promptly been surrounded by 5 to 10 times the number of enemy troops. Sir John Fisher appeared to have derived this idea from the analogy of the 7 Years' War, more than 150 years previously, and Sir Arthur Wilson, his successor, had apparently adopted it. At that stage, Sir William Nicholson, who was Chief of the Imperial General Staff, defending on behalf of the army in this debate, asked Sir Arthur of the Admiralty whether the Admiralty actually had a map of the German strategic railways, and Sir Arthur replied that it was not their business to have such maps. I beg your pardon, said Sir William, if you meddle with military problems, you are bound not only to have them, but to have at least studied them. So we can see at this stage, even in 1911, what the Admiralty intends to happen in the event of war with Germany is far different to what the War Office is actually planning on taking place. So we move on, and by 1913, just months before the war's start, some 2 years later, by now Haig's sort of paper that he'd published had been taken on board. A lot of it had been implemented. But Churchill once again contacts Haig and he asks him to review what happened so far and also give his critique on the status of the newly formed Naval War College and more officer general training across the Navy. Now, this seems quite strange, asking a soldier to do it. Haig's response, though very courteous, is really quite damning. He felt that the Naval War College course that was being run was quite cumbersome, it was outdated, and was certainly not being taken as seriously as the subject deserved. He felt it was more of a nod to training as opposed to the adoption of training, like a tick box exercise. It's quite a lengthy document, would take more than an hour for us to discuss tonight. It was republished by Rosy in the 1950s in one of their journals, so is available online. But among the standout comments that Haig made, we find a couple that I've chosen for you tonight. First one was what Haig said about what he felt was an outdated training syllabus and the importance of having constant review and improvement with regards to your courses. And he makes the point that a comparison between the syllabus of a Camberley Staff College of, say, 1890 and one of today, 1913, would illustrate the extent to which this essential feature has developed in the British Army during the last 2 or 3 decades. Though the Army Staff College is still, I believe, behind that of the Germans and certainly behind that of the French. So he's got his own issues with army training without even talking about how the Navy was doing it. On what he felt was the continuation of rather old school practices, a number of which he suggested should have been dropped in 1911, he notes in the margin, nothing could be more fatal to my mind than the system of war courses and the subsidiary colleges suggested by this committee. For that seems to be nothing more or less than the old garrison class system, one that was discarded by the army over 10 years ago, with what good results we are just beginning to realise, and we should realise them better if, having downed that garrison class system, we could also nail down the crammer courses. So he didn't want any shortcut. He wanted these courses to be tough, to teach naval officers how to fight a next major war. He felt this was quite easy because on the general training of naval officers, he comments, naval training problem seems to me to be far that easier than that of training the army. A maneuver fleet, for instance, far more closely resembles a war fleet than maneuver army resembles a war enemy. At sea, There are no laws of trespass or ground to be hired, to be bought or scheduled, or compensation to be paid. A naval battle does not necessarily become a hopeless muddle directly the opposing forces come to grips. Responsibility comes early in life. Promotion ought to be quicker because the Navy, unlike the Army, is always being expanded instead of being reduced. And lastly, the Navy can take itself quite seriously and prepare for a specific task. No naval officer needs ever to wonder for what purpose the Navy exists or for what it ought to be training for. And the most cutting of his comments, I think, and the last one I'll mention here, is his conclusion, which rather ominously, given that this was written in 1913 and what's going to happen a year later, he says, "But whatever the college's objectives, some time must elapse before its influence can begin to be felt. And in the meantime, we should presumably be careful to steer clear of any wars." That's quite an incredible little statement at the end there. Now, one thing that the Navy and the Army did agree on, however, was the submarine concerns for the coming war and the vital nature of the stretch of ground that hung on the Flanders coast, that little strip of ground that we see there. There was agreement between both heads of service that the potential for Germany to occupy this ground and set up a number of submarine bases represented a significant threat to Britain. And so during the race for the seas, we see that sort of launch in towards Antwerp with the Royal Navy Division in 1914. But of course, this ground does fall into German hands. Now, one would imagine that this immediately becomes key for the British to try and take this ground, and certainly would have been of immediate interest to the BEF, but unfortunately they were now heading southwards towards Paris. I think another element we need to consider in this is why the British don't immediately go to try and reoccupy that ground, is when King Albert, of course, opens the floodgates, something that I don't criticise and I think was a sensible decision at the time. It narrows that strip of land to such that it's never really feasible to be able to generate force and launch a maneuverist campaign up the Flanders coast. It's too narrow a strip. What we now need to do is try and prevent the enemy or deny the enemy that ground really effectively. One area where naval assets were utilised throughout the war in this region was by the use of Royal Naval Air Service air power. This was from Dunkirk, where they had a significant base there, along with coastal raids out across the channel that made by the Dover Patrol. And this was really how Britain maintained its influence over putting boots on the ground on the Flanders coast. In fact, those efforts that the Royal Naval Air Service were significant enough that they did reach land operations in France. Haig was very grateful for this real first example of mutual aid between the Navy and the land forces. And actually, this is recognised by Admiral Jellicoe in his 1921 book, The Crisis of the Naval War, where he says, during the years up to 1917, aerial bombing attacks were persistently carried out on German naval bases in Belgium by the Royal Naval Air Service at Dunkirk. These attacks had as their main objective the destruction of enemy vessels lying in these bases and of their means for their maintenance and repair. Our gallant and efficient airmen were veritable thorns in the sides of the Germans. Our bombing machines, as well as our fighting aircraft, were often required to attack military instead of naval objectives, and several squadrons of our fighting machines were lent to the military for the operations carried out on the Western Front. They did most excellent work and earned the high commendation of Sir Douglas Haig. And that's the first real note I found from the Admiralty recognising Haig's gratitude, really, for naval participation in the war. The real thing I want to talk about at this point about the Flanders coast and why it's kind of off limits to the Brits is something that John Terraine brought our attention to, really, and that is something that's known as Joffre's veto. And John Terraine claims that it was a settled policy of the French government throughout the war to avoid having the British occupy a zone next to the sea and to prevent too close a liaison between the British and the Belgians. Now, that's something that I certainly wasn't aware of, and I find that quite fascinating. And I'd always wondered why there was a couple of French divisions north of the Ypres salient before we hand over to Belgium, despite the fact that the French sector was far to the south. It was almost a deliberate policy by the French. They didn't want us to occupy that Belgian coast. And in fact, Joffre was supposed to have asked Sir John French at an early stage in the war, with sincerity, what is Britain's aims at the end of the war? What parts of mainland Belgium would we like to keep? Which was news to us, really, because I don't think we had any plans to occupy Belgium long term after the war. For Haig now, however, by the time he takes over command of the British Expeditionary Force, any thoughts of naval cooperation were really more of a consideration as opposed to a priority. From February 1916, there's evidence that he has a significant number of meetings with the chap you see on the right there. Doesn't look very happy because he's about to be sacked in 2 weeks after this photograph was taken, but that's Admiral Reginald Bacon. He at the time was the commander of the Dover Patrol and had suggested to Haig a possible amphibious operation that caught Haig's really caught his imagination. However, throughout this, whenever you read Douglas Haig's own writings, he maintains that we agreed that this would not be a feasible operation until the enemy's reserves had been drawn off. I had always held that view. I now directed that the whole operation, whilst it should be worked out in complete detail, but that the moment for execution of the scheme must depend on the military situation. So Haig was never, ever going to use the Operation Hush or the Hush-Hush scheme, more of which in a short while, as a way of breaking the stalemate, but more a way of compounding movement once the British advanced to Passchendaele and captured the area around Roulers. Haig does mention the Navy in his first ever dispatch as the Commander-in-Chief. That's on the 29th of May, 1916, but mainly in their capacity to deliver the BEF into France and to sustain his operations that were fighting in France. In fact, point 920 of the Haig's dispatch notes, I desire to acknowledge the valuable assistance rendered by naval transport officers on the lines of communication. They have worked with and for the army most untiringly, efficiently, and with the utmost harmony. I also desire to acknowledge the indebtedness of the army to the Royal Navy for their unceasing and uniformly successful care in securing the safety of our transport service on the seas. Now, they're nice, kind words, but they would have riled, surely, Fisher, because what would look, intended to be the projectile fired by the Navy was now reading more like that they were a taxi service for the army itself. We do see some naval cooperation in that Haig directly contacts Reginald Bacon for a naval demonstration on the Flanders coast in July 1916 to divert German reserves away from the Somme. Now, that's quite something, isn't it? You think about the distance there. So immediately after the first day of the Somme, Haig is requesting the Navy cause some issues on the Flanders coast to try and direct some of the German reserves away. And in fact, Haig appears to have a fairly good opinion of Reginald Bacon. In fact, he describes him as being a capital fellow, which I think is quite a nice turn of phrase. There's considerable correspondence between the two, which suggests that he was continually keeping a close eye on this potential of an amphibious operation. But to what extent of that, I'm still not convinced myself. What I do know is he sends the man there you can see in the photograph looking towards the camera, William Peyton. Now, Peyton at the time had an important job within the BEF. He was actually Haig's military secretary in France. He was in charge of, the group that hired and fired people for Haig. These, rather than him do it himself, these are the guys that assessed on skills, on reports, of the individuals before they're promoted, as opposed to the antiquated army way of whether they were a good fellow and they were in the same golf course. Now, Paignton had experience, and this is the first time we see this, but it's something that's going to be repeated throughout the talk, had experience of working with the Navy because he'd commanded the 2nd Mounted Division in August 1914 in the Gallipoli campaign, where the 2nd Mounted Division fight from the Salt Lake, across the Salt Lake, up Chocolate Hill and onto Scimitar Hill. And I think it's no coincidence that it's a Gallipoli man that goes to deal with the Navy, because they had a little bit more understanding about maritime affairs than someone who'd only spent their time on the Western Front. Now, all throughout this time, it's quite clear that there are growing concerns about that submarine threat. If you look at the map in the center of the screen there, you get a good view of what I mean. There's the ports of Ostend and Zeebrugge, and they are linked by the Ostend-Zeebrugge Canal, or Bruges Canal. This means that you can't just block one, you have to block both of them, because you need to seal off both entrances and exits. It's just one of the German U-boat options, really. In fact, only about 1/3 of German submarines used this route from Zeebrugge to Ostend. However, as we'll come back to again, it was one that was directly accessible for the Dover Patrol, whereas some of the other ones were out of reach. So it became important. So bombardment of this area continued throughout the war. The man on the left there, by the time we get to December 1916, that's Herbert Asquith, the Prime Minister. Well, of course, he'd lost his son, Raymond, only a few months earlier on the Somme, buried in Guillemont Road Cemetery. But he says in December 1916, there is no operation of war to which the War Committee would attach greater importance than the successful occupation, or at least the deprivation to the enemy, of Ostend, and especially Zeebrugge. He can see by this stage, Asquith, the problems that the U-boat menace was starting to have on Allied shipping. Charles Reppington, chap on the right there, real character in his own right, but quite an influential correspondent of the war at the time. He is very harsh in his view in January 1917, where he says, "It is my view, it was at present a question of whether our armies could win the war before our navies lost it." Now that sounds like a very bitter army view. However, in April of the same year, we see that view being echoed by someone fairly high ranking in the Admiralty, that's Admiral Beatty, who, writing to his wife, says, "The army are doing all they can to win the war, and we are doing our best to lose it, which is heartbreaking." That's quite damning stuff, isn't it? In fact, the problem with unrestricted submarine warfare that had now come in was, as predicted, almost catastrophic. And that map on the left just gives you an idea of the amount of Allied ships that were being lost in and around the coast of the UK and up through the Channel port at the time. It really does bring into perspective the problem of the Flanders coast and exactly how that becomes a bit of a priority. Lord Beresford, who is speaking at the House of Commons, is recorded in Hansard as saying, "I will give the House the total losses for 1917 up to date, first by mine and torpedo. There are a little more than 5 million tons of British, Allied and neutral ships. Remember, it is Allied and neutral tons that is really feeding us, because we have taken away 75% of our own mercantile marine for war purposes. In addition, we must remember that we lost just 4 million tons from August 14 up until January 1917. So in a matter of months, they'd lost more shipping than they'd lost in the whole of the war up to that point. And that's obviously going to cause concern, and in some areas, as we'll see shortly, almost panic." Beresford continues, "I do not propose, however, to dwell on our total losses, but to deal only with losses this year. We also lost by raiders over 160,000 tons, and the average losses up until December the 31st, if we take them in the proportion they have been, will be about 800,000 tons more." So real concerns being spoken at the very highest level about this submarine warfare. And even though, just to repeat, the Admiralty realised that only a third of Germany's submarines were using the Flanders coast, it was our real readily accessible way of doing something. So to that end, it means the Admiralty really are starting to push in certain areas for a resumption of the hush-hush scheme. Now, Professor Gary Sheffield, as I'm sure many of you on this call will be aware of, would slap my wrist if I didn't point out that the hush-hush scheme was exactly that. It was a scheme, not an operation as such, in that whilst we prepared for it, it was never written up to the point that it was going to be launched. It was more of a sort of a thought process as opposed to an actual realistic idea. It was largely the Gallipoli gang of people that were involved. Of course, they had learnt lessons from amphibious operations. I'm not going to even begin to suggest Gallipoli was a success, but certainly the evacuation was, and the ability to transport things across, and certain lessons that had been learnt in the Gallipoli Peninsula were of relevance for any upcoming operation. Douglas Haig actually sent Hunter Weston to cooperate, and from when we read Douglas Haig's diary, I think it's fairly safe to assume that for him this was as much an episode of psyops as it was reality. In fact, to back that up, when Haig learnt that a fleet of small boats was now in Dunkirk ready to transport the 1st Division to Ostend, he noted in his diary, "By the rumour of this operation, we hope to make the enemy strengthen his garrison on the coast." So you've got Haig there talking directly at the time about this being a ruse to draw more Germans into the Flanders coast as opposed to a realistic opportunity to land. Then almost in opposite to that, at the same time, he writes to Bacon again, recommending that should he go for the operation, he should use 100 tanks that have recently become successful or useful on the Western Front. These should be manned by naval personnel, and they should be landed on flat-bottom boats to break through the enemy defences. And those two photographs you see there that's how close Hush Hush came to being an operation from a scheme, is that a number of these long pontoon ramps were built and up near Tilbury, and they were to be towed across and landed not opposite Ostend itself. That would have been suicidal, but just to the south of that, a place called Middlekirk, where, as you can see from their arrows, they would then move to the left, move to the right, and enfilade the town, whilst the force went directly up towards Zeebrugge. Now, there is some interesting innovation that takes part in this plan. And that is at West End itself, there is a sizable seawall, one that's still in existence, as you can see there on the left of the photograph that was taken on a recent visit by myself. And this was going to be a formidable obstacle that they didn't think the tanks would be able to get up against. So they decided to find out if anyone had any idea exactly the dimensions of that seawall. Was there any operatives working in occupied Belgium that could help us out? And actually the answer was directly on our doorstep, because incredibly, in a stroke of luck, the architect of the seawall had fled to Calais, where the British authorities managed to track him down. And he said, well, interestingly, the last thing I did before I left was pick up my briefcase with the blueprint for the wall in it. So we were able to build a replica wall, which is the one you can see on your right, which they built somewhere south of Calais, Boulogne. And I think that was so sizable that it's still going to be in a farmer's barns, farmer's field somewhere. I'd love to go and find it one day. It's one of those areas I've always wanted to visit and see if I can locate this sea wall. And there enough, you can see how the tanks were going to surmount the sea wall. They were literally going to have a ramp that was fitted on the tank, and by using the tracks, it would actually roll over the top, a bit like an unditching beam, unhook, and then you drive up the ramp to get over the wall, and they would be able to bridge that wall. But of course, was never actually used because, as I've said all along, Haig maintains that the landings were always dependent on the Passchendaele offensive having reached rulers, which it never does. and of course it didn't. But on top of that, the Germans, getting a view of an upcoming operation, launched their own offensive at Newport, known as Operation Strandfest. And for those that question whether the Germans have a sense of humour like our own, Strandfest translates to Operation Beach Party. And with that, all plans were later shelved. And what that actually means is that things really are going to come to a bit of a head between the Admiralty and the Army. And this really takes place in 1917. So we'll just build up to a little bit. There on the left-hand side there, you can see another image of Admiral Reginald Bacon. He'd been in command of the Dover Patrol now since April 1915. Funny enough, his first job before that, he was meant to take a 15-inch gun down to Gallipoli and land it. But just as he was getting that ready, he was sent to the Admiralty and then given job of the Dover Patrol, so never actually served in Gallipoli itself. Bacon was a man that Jackie Fisher originally acknowledged as being the cleverest officer in the Navy. He was, however, despite Haig calling him a capital fellow, undoubtedly somewhat Marmite-like, a rather controversial figure. And Patrick Beasley, who wrote a very good book recently called Room 40, Naval Intelligence 1418, described him as being convinced that he was the only man in the regiment who was marching in step. And I think that's a lovely description. We get a picture of exactly how he wasn't a man to sort of argue with. A real stickler for regulation. He was thoroughly committed to the main defences against submarines being the North Sea Mine Barrage. Now, this was a simply magical logistical effort that on paper was originally going to have up to 400,000 mines laid. In actual fact, it was nearer to 70,000 mines that were laid in strips across between Orkneys and Norway to protect Allied shipping lanes. The mine barrage only really became effective after Bacon had left his post and had been replaced by Roger Keyes, when eventually that claimed 8 U-boats, all of these between August and October 1918, and many of them because they were rushing through that minefield to escape some of the Dover Patrol's new tactics. More of that shortly. The lack of operational efficiency that existed within the Dover Patrol and generally anti-submarine tactics employed at the time really came to a head on the 19th of June 1917, which is mildly significant in that that was Douglas Haig's birthday. But far from having a giant cake, he was actually in London explaining his plans to the cabinet, to the War Cabinet, sorry, about the upcoming offensive at Passchendaele to take on the second half of 1917. And as he was actually going through these plans to everyone that was sat around, Admiral Jellicoe, who is the man you see there on the right, interrupted Haig in mid-flow and burst out with, "There is no good discussing plans for next spring. We simply can't go on." Now, Haig obviously recalls this meeting himself in his memoirs, where he says, "A most serious and startling situation was disclosed today. At today's conference, Admiral Jellicoe, the first Sea Lord, stating that owing to the great shortage of shipping due to German submarines, it would be impossible for Great Britain to continue the war in 1918. This was a bombshell for all the cabinet and everyone present. A full inquiry is to be made as to the real facts on which this opinion of the naval authorities is based. No one present shared Jellicoe's view, and all seemed satisfied that the food reserves in Great Britain were quite adequate. In fact, a report within a matter of days did establish that there was roughly 2.5 years worth of food and also ability to sustain a war effort in the UK. But I think the combination of the submarine menace becoming a real threat, along with their lack of a feeling that they could do anything about it, was starting to play, and stress and worries on both these two men would need to lead to a bit of a change at the very top. Now, this really horrified Lloyd George, of course, not someone who normally sided with Haig, but the very next day they breakfasted together along with Eric Geddes, remember the man that introduced the railway system across the Western Front and now was shortly to join the Admiralty to see if he could sort out logistics and admin there as well. And this breakfast meeting is really significant because it leads to change at the very top of the Royal Navy. Now, whether this was solely on Haig's recommendation or not, I think might be stretching the case a bit far. But as John Terraine once again comments, it is one of the more curiosities of the strange and complex times that Lloyd George should attach such weight to Haig's recommendations on naval affairs and so little on the work of his own service. And I find that amazing that Lloyd George is listening to Haig's sort of mutterings on what should be happening at the Admiralty, whilst in effect he's not trusting Haig's judgment of what's occurring on the Western Front. What this leads to is a renewed effort within the Admiralty, and certainly on the recommendation of certain members of the Admiralty that stay behind, along with Geddes and Haig. We see the appointment of Roger Keyes there on the left, who's to go on to command the Dover Patrol, and Rosy Wemyss, or Rosy Weems, sorry, taken over as First Sea Lord from Jellicoe. Again, both these men had served at Gallipoli and worked alongside ground forces. And there was a number of plans they inherited that were already in place at the Admiralty from Bacon in his time, and very much the shadow of the hush-hush scheme pretty much loomed large over the Admiralty at this time. One of the most bizarre events is recalled by Roger Keyes when he took over post, where he said, talking about Bacon, another of his schemes, which he has described in great detail, was to land an 18-inch gun, some 70 foot long, weighing 150 tons, directly after West End had been captured by his great landing. The gun and its mounting were to be carried across the channel on the bulges of a monitor, transferred on one of his special platoons, landed during the night, and transmounted inside the Palace Hotel, West End. This was to camouflage the erection of the gun position. The next morning, the gun was to bombard the lock gates at Zeebrugge and the naval bases at Bruges. The shooting of the 18-inch gun from shore emplacements inside the hotel lobby should have been so accurate that the destruction of the lock gates should have been a matter of comparatively few rounds. That's quite incredible, really, because what we do know is the concussion from an 18-inch gun would have promptly brought floors 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 down onto the poor gunners in the lobby of the hotel. Clearly that warning that Haig given about trespassing and the idea to purchase property hadn't been heeded. But incredibly, this plan, as Keyes continues, had got beyond paper. There was actually a working model installed in the flag lieutenant's office, which incidentally gave him no room to work, until much to his relief I had it removed. Key says, I've often wondered since why so much time, thought and expense were devoted to the great landing and this project. I took an early opportunity of discussing these operations with Sir Douglas Haig and Willie Robertson, in case the conditions which led up to the idea of the great landing should reoccur. I asked them if they had any doubt as to the fate which awaited the 1st Division if it landed in that hornet's nest. They both assured me that there was never any question of a landing in the face of opposition. The enterprise would not have been launched until rulers had been captured, and when rulers fell, the Flanders coast, Ostend, Zeebrugge and Bruges would automatically be abandoned by the Germans. So we got another indication there of Haig's a belief that this would actually become a bit of an issue. I should mention that 18-inch gun idea as well by Bacon. Remember what I said earlier, he was about to take a large gun down to Gallipoli before he got posted. He clearly never got that idea out of his system and wanted to recreate it there on the Flanders coast. Now, really, this is an important part of the story, because what happens to Roger Keyes and the Dover Patrol under his command? Well, incredibly, the unveiling of new tactics, or the implementation of new strategies and tactics, had actually reduced those shipping losses by the spring of 1918 from those of 1917 by some 60%, which is quite incredible. On top of that, the amount of submarines that had been sunk by the Dover Patrol up until Keyes' arrival was 0, and yet he managed to sink 5 in the first month that he was in charge. This was down largely, often it's given credit for the convoy system, which was implemented across the fleet at this stage, but more importantly is the air patrols. This is an aspect that's perhaps overlooked. Air patrols over the Channel coast, which could see up and above and down onto where the submarines were operating, would have been very similar to the impact of drone warfares having we see played out at Ukraine now. It was in its infancy, but very, very effective. So much so that no ships had actually been lost during that time when they were protected by air patrols. One of the most fascinating elements of all this is something, and I would, if you're still awake and you get to the end of this talk, if you do want to read something fantastic, go and find yourself a book called The Spider's Web. Something I knew nothing about, but absolutely fascinating. The Spider's Web is something that was the brainchild of a number of people that were posted, Douglas Haig being one, at Felixstowe Experimental Station. This were a number of seaplanes and were operating from, or flying boats, whichever you'd like to call it. I know there is a difference. I'm sure someone will remind me what it is. We're operating out of Felixstowe. And for any of you that have stayed up late at night and listened to the shipping forecast, you will undoubtedly have heard the instantly forgettable name of the North Hinder light vessel. Now, the North Hinder light vessel was a Dutch-operated neutral lighthouse that sat right in the middle between the Suffolk coast there and the Hook of Holland. And it had been noted by a number of patrols that most of the submarines that were seen on the surface were seen in and around the North Hinder light vessel. What was clear was that when they're out on a long patrol, they would feel safe when they got to the dead center, and therefore they would surface and run on top to conserve their battery power. So by operating a system where you drew a spider's web, as you can see on the screen, around that North Hinder light vessel and separated it up into segments, a lone seaplane patrol would be able to cover 2 of those segments in one routine patrol. And if you had air-to-air coverage, which we then go on to see what the Royal Air Force of the Second World War referred to as the cab rank system, by continually having people up, you'd be able to cover the whole of that area within that spider's web. And as a result, it almost became impossible for submarines to operate and literally push them away. Now, the reason I'm telling you this in such detail is quite simply that the Zeebrugge raid, which we're about to turn our attention to, one of the reasons why it probably didn't need to take place was because all of the things that had been implemented by the Dover Patrol had already achieved what Zeebrugge was set out to originally achieve. However, there is another reason why Zeebrugge is relevant, and that is the situation that was occurring on the Western Front as we get to the spring of 1918, the collapse of Russia, 1 million spare Germans that they send to the Western Front. The arrival of American troops in great numbers means the Germans have got to act before that imbalance is redressed by the Allies. So they launched their offences. The most famous one amongst us as Brits, no doubt, is the offensive of the 21st of March, where they push us all the way back almost to Villers-Bretonneux and the gates of Amiens before they're stopped. However, I'm sure most people, military historians, would agree, a more worrying time for Britain was actually the next operation, the Battle of the Lys, where pressure up to the north in and around the Ypres salient back towards Balliol and Hazebrouck at one stage meant that we were almost in a position where we were going to have to withdraw from the Western Front itself, and we certainly didn't want to lose contact with our French allies that were also retreating. Further to the south, I should also mention there the Second Battle of the Marne, which involves French, American, Italian, and British troops, of course, a number of divisions, including 62nd West Riding Division. David Tattersfield wouldn't like me not to mention them there. And all I would say very quickly about that is that the Second Battle of the Marne is the turning point of the war. 17th, 19th of July 1918 is when we turn the tide. Not the 8th of August at Amiens, which is when we start to say the 100 Days Offensive begins. Undoubtedly, it's largely French, American, some British involvement, troops down on the Second Battle of Marne, and that deserves more credit. Anyway, I digress. the situation is so bad up in and around Ypres that something needs to happen, and something needs to happen fairly quickly. And so as a result, the Zeebrugge raid is launched on St. George's Day, April the 23rd, 1918. Now, this was a significant operation, some 75 ships, some of them used as blocking vessels that were going to be towed in. They had underneath them, they had concrete in the hull, so when the bottoms were blown out, they would literally sink. Well, they wouldn't tow themselves in, they could get in under their own steam, I should say, and then sink and block the exits. There were going to be submarines trying to smash their way through as almost like pilotless torpedoes on a large scale. There was raiding parties by Royal Marines, 4th Battalion Royal Marines, alongside Royal Naval storming parties, and this was going to happen Ostend and at Zeebrugge at the same time. And of course the coastal motorboats and little MTBs were whizzing around causing havoc as well as significant pyrotechnics. It's the sort of stuff that appears on that primary source material you see on the right there, the Victor comic, something that certainly was an influence on me as a young child, and always found it a really fascinating campaign. I've already said, why did we launch Zeebrugge? It's strange, really, because what we know at this stage is the submarines were already in a reduced capacity out of Ostend and Zeebrugge because of the spider's web and the various things that Dover Patrol was up to. We needed to do something because what was happening in April 1918 on a wider front. I mean, I think what's significant is when you look at the cost, and this is taken from another talk that I gave you, I think, a year or so ago. Some of you may remember about Zeebrugge, so you might remember this stat. But the cost in human terms was 227 British dead, around 356 people wounded in that raid. It was a raid that involved 75 ships and 1,700 men. It really was an Admiralty affair to show the army that we, Jack Tar, stood alongside Tommy Atkins. I find what most incredible at all, and I'm indebted to Mark Connolly's from the University of Kent's research into this subject that really has opened my eyes to a lot of things at Zeebrugge, is that stat there. 8 German dead and 24 wounded. I mean, the cover of Victor Comics shows about 50 of them being killed by one Jack Tar himself, while they're all shouting "Acton, Acton, Englander." So I mean, I say that in jest, but I still find that an amazing stat that only 8 Germans actually killed in the Zeebrugge raid, especially when I think we have 6 or 7 Victoria Crosses. It's quite incredible. Zeebrugge really was about showing that we weren't out of it and transmitting that to a wider audience, the Americans in particular, and showing the Brits, the British soldiers on the Western Front, that something was fighting back. Now, Haig was one of those that was first to say thank you for the naval bravery shown there. On the left, you can see that stereoscopic view is of Haig visiting some of the people that had taken part in the Zeebrugge raid. But on the right, I've shown you that so you can see them and note them down. These are 2 volumes that should be on anyone's shelves if they're interested in the Great War. These are Roger Keyes' memoirs. I did mention earlier, I think, that Keyes only gets a single mention in Haig's diary, yet Haig gets 18 mentions in Keyes' own memoirs. So they've been really rich in material for the presentation this evening. And when it comes to Zeebrugge, Keyes mentions that Haig was one of the first to throw his hat into the ring to thank him. It says, "I received scores of telegrams from battalions, divisions, corps and armies across the Western Front, as well as from individual friends. But the best of all came from the Army's great chief, Sir Douglas Haig, whose telegram gave us immense pleasure. It read, 'On behalf of the Army in France, please accept for yourself and all ranks engaged our most hearty congratulations on the success of your operation against Zeebrugge and Ostend. St. George's Day was indeed a fitting date for such a daring feat of arms.'" Now, again, that adds to the propaganda side of it, because we know that actually the Zeebrugge raid wasn't anywhere near as successful as we made it out to be at the time. But it's the start of a relationship between Keyes and Haig that is going to flourish. And in fact, just prior to the Zeebrugge raid, so actually Haig wouldn't have known the exact date it was going to be launched by the sounds of this next entry in his diary. But Keyes remembers being receiving a telephone call from Douglas Haig asking him to come over and see him as soon as I could spend the time. Well, I couldn't go over on the eve of our Zeebrugge expedition, so to me that suggests that Haig perhaps didn't know it was about to take place, but I did visit GHQ on the 26th of April 1918. Our meeting was along with General Plumer and took place in the abandoned headquarters on Mount Cassel. From there, I watched our guns blowing off the top of Mont Kemmel, which is the view you can see on your screen there, which must have been a very unpleasant spot for the Germans to occupy. The generals were very nice to me about our efforts on the Belgian coast, but the atmosphere was rather depressing, and I could see they were having an anxious time. Douglas Haig said to me that he'd asked me to come over to inform me that it was absolutely essential to keep contact with the left flank of the French army, and that worryingly, he might have to fall back beyond the Channel ports at the Dunkirk may well have to be abandoned before too long. Now, this would have been a real shock to Roger Keyes, because Dunkirk was a key part of bombarding those ports. So he went back in a state of real concern to report to the Admiralty. But luckily, when he got back to Dunkirk, the first person he met was the Admiral you can see there that's just come up. This is Admiral Rosy of the French Navy. And understanding the importance of Dunkirk with regards to the defence of the Channel and the Thames estuary, the French Admiral assured Keyes quite unreservedly that even if the BEF were not in a position to defend Dunkirk, France would, and they would hold it with all their might. And this really did put Roger Keyes' mind at rest somewhat. Now, I mentioned that Haig only mentions Keyes once, and it's a little bit later. It's on the 1st of September 1918, but it's quite important. It says, Admiral Keyes was here last night. I explained to him the military situation on the Western Front, and I gave him the opinion that it is quite possible that the enemy may well be forced back in the near future, eastward from the Hindenburg line. He may also be obliged shortly to retire from Western Belgium and the coast. I asked Keyes to consider the possible situation from a naval point of view, so as to be able to cooperate immediately with Plumer and the Belgians whenever the situation becomes favourable. I asked him to consider the possibility of landing troops on the Belgian coast, not in the face of the enemy, but as a means for rapidly reaching Bruges and placing our left flank on the Dutch frontier. So that shows you, even in September 1918, Haig did have a scenario where he would like the Navy to have landed, but only after they'd withdrew past Roulers and it became a viable option again. And there was quite a few further meetings between Roger Keyes and Douglas Haig over the next few weeks, as the two men began to form what was a really fruitful working relationship, and one that would last beyond the war. Perhaps one of the most interesting one occurs just a week later, on the 9th of September 1918, where Roger Keyes mentions we had just finished lunch when Douglas Haig came down and, taking me aside, asked in an undertone if I could take him to England at once. He showed me a spot on a roadside on a map and asked if I could meet him there, and then that we travelled to Calais together, and he would tell me all about it on the journey. Very clandestine and secretive. Effectively, what had just occurred is Haig had been told by Foch that they intended to end the war in 1918. Now, this would be very much news for the people in London. So Haig needed to get himself across there, explain to the War Cabinet what the plan was, and get back before anyone knew that he was missing. This would also involve the naval occupation of Ostend and Zeebrugge as soon as the Germans withdrew. Now, fortunately for Roger Keyes, the vessel on the right had just become available. This was faster than anything in the Dover Patrol. It went at a rate of 30 knots and, by coincidence, was actually called HMS Douglas. And this became Haig's taxi. It was on standby for him to get across to London whenever he needed to, often without the people from his headquarters realising he'd gone, to speak important stuff to London and get back again to the front. Quite incredible, really, that that cooperation existed at such a short notice. On the 3rd of October 1918, again, Keyes goes up to see Sir Douglas Haig, and he says, I had a very interesting evening with Sir Douglas, and while I was his guest, I learnt much. I heard a good deal from his staff of what was going on. I found some old friends on Haig's staff, among them Herb and Lawrence, with whom I'd worked closely on the evacuation at Gallipoli, that whole Gallipoli link coming back again. He arranged for me to have a battlefield tour on my way back to Calais. And we know from looking at that route that he would have gone to Arras and up to Bethune and Luz and gone across the old battlefields that have recently been drawn from the Germans and visit them as a battlefield tour in October 1918. And then after the war, lastly, I should mention in May 1919, where Keyes again meets up with Douglas Haig, and it says, while I was at Rosyth, Sir Douglas Haig passed through on his way to Aberdeen. He was to be made an honorary dean at the university, an honour which was also to be conferred upon me. So we went there together. The undergraduates gave us a very warm, though rather a boisterous welcome. Directly after the ceremony at the university, a number of young soldiers seized Sir Douglas, and some sailors, mainly RMVR doctors, seized me, and they carried us together through the streets to City Hall, where we to lunch. Now, we should, as we come towards the conclusion, also mention this chap because he's very important into our story, and that's Rosy Wemyss. And I did mention him a bit earlier. He was actually the first Sea Lord. As you can see from this stylized painting, he was also the most senior British figure in the railway carriage in Compiègne Forest for the signing of the armistice there, but a big red ring around him. Rosy talks quite kindly about Haig. You can see that he really did respect him. In October 1918, both Admiral Beatty and Douglas Haig were called back to London to sort of get some information on what the peace terms would be. And Rosy Wemyss recalls, Douglas Haig asked for a destroyer to take him back to France. I replied, if I could, I would put the entire Grand Fleet at his disposal. I have great admiration for Haig's quiet courage, his dignity, and the abnegation with which he was always ready to sacrifice his own interests for those of his country. And then just a few months later, when it comes to the post-war awards, of which Weems again was First Sea Lord at the time, was involved in the awarding of, he says that Admiral Beatty, for public reasons, was offered an earldom. It was difficult to get the right balance, for it's certain the latter, Beatty's services, could in no manner be individually compared to those of Sir Douglas Haig, but a lower rank for Beatty would have been a slur to naval prestige. So just hints at the political nature of the awards scheme at the end of the war. So in conclusion then, with that photograph again of Sir Douglas Haig along some of his naval colleagues there, what was Haig's relationship and influence over naval affairs during the war? Now, my initial findings, and remember I only had 1 week or so to prepare this talk, can only just be that. And I'm hoping people tonight might be able to put me on to some stuff that I'm not aware of to add. But what I found really is that post-war, there were still a number of influential characters, Charles Repington being amongst them, that remained scathing about the Royal Navy's pre-war planning. As late as 1919, Repington was still complaining about how the Navy went into the war by writing, I put down the whole of the naval disappointments during the war to the want of a war staff and the absence of the serious thinking department of the Admiralty. This came indeed, or at all events it was initiated in Winston Churchill's day, but by then the war was just upon us, and it takes many decades for a thinking branch to study history and the facts of the present day, to work out strategy and tactics, and to create a sound doctrine of the conduct of war. Now, I feel that whilst there might be a bit of basis in that, I think that's slightly unfair, because what we do know by 1918, down due to Douglas Haig, alongside a number of those, notably Rosy Wemyss and Roger Keyes heading up the Admiralty, a lot of that argument had been negated. And the instances I wanted to give you were the fact I felt like that many other aspects of Haig's tenure of Commander-in-Chief, I think there's significant evidence that he as an individual learns on the job and grows into the role. I think Haig was able to grasp certainly by the second half of 1917, exactly how the Royal Naval operated, both operationally and politically, and how both arms of service could coexist, often to mutual benefit. I think Haig really understood what people were needed for the right jobs, and as such, he did rely heavily on the men with Gallipoli experience. Now, again, I'd say that whilst Gallipoli was not a military success, it was at this time the most recent experience, really, of maritime ground force integration. I would want to reinforce Lloyd George, what John Terrain mentioned to us, the fact that Lloyd George listened and almost adopted some of Haig's views on the Admiralty, whilst at the same time not fully trusting his judgment on the progression of the land campaign. To me, that's one of the most bizarre and fascinating political dichotomies of the war. But I think overall, and it's something we see quite often with Haig, is that his own personality led to him forging relationships with many of the high-ranking members of the Admiralty, and many of them who had previously been described as difficult men, so that by late 1918, both the senior service and the BEF were cooperating on the Western Front in ways that were simply unimaginable in 1914. But I just wanted to finish with this wonderful photograph here. You may have seen it on one of my talks previously. My wife worked in eye surgery, she still does, but certainly in the sort of mid-1990s, she was well trained to look on anyone coming in for cataract or any sort of surgery for their dates of birth. And if they were between the ages of 1896 and 1900, after the operation, when they recovered, she'd go up to them and say, "Would you like to meet my husband? He's interested in the First World War." And once I got to meet a chap who lived in Hemel Hempstead, who was an army photographer, and he said, "I've got a load of photographs, some officer bloke, but they're all a bit blurry, so they were never used." And they're actually a series of photographs of Douglas Haig taken as he leaves the Western Front for the last time, and this is one of those photographs, and I think it's quite a decent guess the caption competition. If you look at those two poor sailors there, one speaking to the other, and I'm always people offering up exactly what they think's going on. Well, to my mind, I think that he's the older bloke saying to the younger bloke, "Well, I'm not going to go and tell him. Why don't you tell him?" Because if we zoom in here, we can see Haig as a passenger on his way back to the UK, standing there on the navigation bridge. And if I just highlight that sign there, it says passengers are not allowed on the navigating bridge. So we can see here an example of Douglas Haig breaking the rules, but I wonder who was going to tell him. So that concludes my talk. I'll obviously dedicate it to two people, Robin Broadhurst, who's the real reason why we're talking, and for many of you that would have known him as well, a late, very important, good friend of mine, Terry Webb. Some of you would have been in the battlefields with him before, who passed away as well, suddenly, only last week. So that's for you too. And the advert plug, I wouldn't want to miss it. The WFA National Tours, brilliant tours. 4 or 5 spaces left on each one. Come to the battlefields with myself and Jack Sheldon, and we'll show you a fine weekend. Thank you, David. Over to you.
Thanks very much indeed, Clive. That's tremendous. First of all, let's do the usual silent round of applause by pressing the raise hands on the Zoom software, which I can confirm, Clive, that there's hundreds of hands shooting up virtually on the Zoom here, just as a round of applause for that. If you want to expand a little bit more on the Western Front Association tours that we're running, the 2 of them, please feel free to just spend a few seconds on this, just whilst people tap in the questions.
Well, yeah, they really are cracking trips. I'm very proud to be part of them. We've been doing them now for over 10 years, but we seem to have a core group that come back every year. And of course, the membership of the WFA is far larger than the amount of people we can take. So we'd like to encourage more people to come along, if only to give everyone the opportunity, because you know, as a member of the WFA, you're entitled to join these tours. There's pickups certainly in the Midlands. Coach company we use is from Yorkshire, does pick up at Watford Gap, so it's not, you don't have to get to London to get on board anymore like the old days. And it's rather a unique combination of Jack Sheldon and myself, really. Jack, obviously, given the German side of it, and then I put across the Allied side. So the first one this year is to look at Arras. The itinerary, if it looks a bit vague on the website, that's because we build it around you. So rather than look at the tour and say, "Oh, that doesn't go where I want to go," send us an email and say, "I want to go here in Arras," and we build it in. That's the whole point of these tours, is that you dictate the itinerary. And that's hard to get grasp initially, but that's the whole point of them. So Arras in the spring or the June trip, and then when in the autumn, we're off to Verdun, which is always a fantastic trip to do with Jack as well. Lots to see down there.
Thanks for that. Clive, I just wondered if you can just talk briefly about any, what you're just hoping that we might find, if anybody can provide you with sources. I mean, you said that in our practice session earlier that the sources on this talk are very thin indeed. So what, aspirationally, what do you think is out there? Do you think there's a smoking gun where there's a secret diary of Sir Douglas Haig where he says, "Oh, the Royal Navy, what a pile of rubbish"?
Well, no, I mean, I find it fascinating that he you know, before the war, he writes he's asked to write a report on naval affairs and the you know, the adoption of a staff college and a war college within the Navy, which I think is, and obviously a naval general staff, so mirroring what's happening in the army at times. So that's interesting. But then when he takes over the job as the main chief, he doesn't forget all that, and he tries to establish relationships again with the Royal Navy and with the right people involved, of which I think, you know, Weems and Rosy Wemyss and Roger Keyes were. It becomes quite a prosperous relationship in the last year of the war. So it all ends very, very well. And that could have been very differently. That could have turned out very differently indeed. I mean, I'm not too worried about a lack of questions because, you know, the Douglas Haig Fellowship was in front of the, you know, supposed community of Haig scholars. And at the end, there were very few questions as well. And in fact, the first question was more of a point, which was that Paul Robin, before he passed away, had contacted Kathy Stevenson and said, "I'm struggling for this talk in January because there's not a lot out there." So that was a bit of a relief to me when I found out that, you know, I'd not missed the major points. But John Hussey's offered me up a copy of that report that he wrote, which is quite important. I don't think that's seen the light of day since the 1950s. In a Rosy journal. So there is stuff out there, and we just see if we can build a bit of picture about how the Army and the Navy did integrate and work together on the Western Front, because we assume that's always going to be Gallipoli, Palestine to a lesser extent, Salonika for a lesser extent. But, you know, what was the Navy's role on the Western Front, and how important was that Flanders coast? I mean, how many of us visit the battlefields and don't go to that area?
Yeah,
you've been, David, because I took your branch there, but it's, you know, it's fascinating, isn't it?
absolutely. Yeah, it's the front of the old I've forgotten the warship's name. Vindictive.
Yeah, absolutely. That Ostend, yeah.
Ostend, yeah. So yeah, truly fascinating place to see. Do you think things might have been different had Jackie Fisher not pressed the self-destruct button in 15 and continued in charge? Do you think that there'd been any different relationships between Haig and Fisher had Fisher carried on and counterfactual?
I think it would have done. You know, I don't think that's purely an Admiralty problem. I think that's a generational problem, because I think if John French had continued in post, we'd have seen it similarly from the Army style. You know, the Great War is a significant learning curve, isn't it? For, that's a word that we shouldn't use really with the BF in particular, I know, because it's a up and down as opposed to a curve, but, you know, it's adapting to a different type of war. You know, the nearest thing the Brits said, or the British Army had to a major land war was the Boer War, which you could argue wasn't actually a conventional war fighting scenario. So, you know, we go back to the Crimea, whereas for the Navy, it's going back to Trafalgar for their, you know, by the time they go to Jutland. So there's long periods of gaps where you learn new things and tactics and you trying them out, and you need younger sorts of officers with a fresh view on that. So I think if we'd have stuck with Sir John French in charge of the Army and Fisher in charge of the Navy, or even perhaps John Jellicoe to the end of the war, you wouldn't have got anywhere near the cooperation in 1918 that we did have.
Look, on that basis, Clive, it's 9:20, so it's 10 minutes before the watershed when we do cut this off. So I think on that note, I'll say thanks very much indeed for your super presentation this evening. Thoroughly enjoyed it. If anybody's wanting to look further into the battle honours in conjunction with Western Front Association tours to the Western Front next year, just have a quick look on the WFA website, or pop an email through to me or Clive, and we'll point you in the direction of what we're talking about on the website in terms of the outline of the tour. If anybody's yet to register for next week's webinar, please do so. We've got Professor Margaret Cox talking about finding the Australians from Els. It's about the DNA system that was done for the new cemetery at Fromelles. So, Clive, thanks very much indeed for your presentation tonight. Thanks everybody for watching, and we'll see you later. Thanks very much. Good night.
Mademoiselle from Armentières, parlez-vous. Mademoiselle from Armentières, parlez-vous. Mademoiselle from Armentières, she hasn't been kissed for 40 years. Hickey, picky, parlez-vous. Out on kicking Armentières, parlez-vous. Out on kicking Armentières, parlez-vous. Out on kicking Armentières, broke the spell of 40 years. Hickey, picky, parlez-vous. The officers get